So we're working again on the engine that's come out of this Celica, the blown up engine. We already know what caused the engine failure. It was a spun bearing on the conrod. But today it's more a case of finding out whether the engine is rebuildable or economical to rebuild. Possible reasons that we couldn't rebuild the engine, that could be if a main bearing has spun. The crank's already had a spun bearing on a conrod, which obviously means the conrods had to go in the bin. It's no longer going to be reusable. But if a main bearing spun, then the actual engine block itself is going to be unusable, and therefore the pistons, the rings, the freshly honed cylinder walls, all that is going to be wasted if the block is no longer reusable. So we've currently dismantled pretty much everything off the engine. If you haven't seen those videos, go back and check them out, and make sure you're updated before you watch this. So today really we just got to take off a couple of pulleys, take off the oil pump, and then pull out the crank and the main caps. So yeah, let's get to it. So if you've ever heard of the term claw puller, well, this is what a claw puller is. And basically I'm trying to remove this pulley off this crank without damaging it. And I've done that on the crank pulley, but I didn't video it. So I'm going to show you how it works on this one. Now basically when you tighten up this thread here, this will actually move up the thread. And these claws are actually attached to that, and they're going to move up with it. So it's in effect going to pull this pulley off the crank, and this thread here is going to press onto the crank as well. So I've put a socket there. People generally do this just to spread the load and to minimize the risk of damage to the crank. So when I put my impact driver on this, or a ratchet or a spanner, and tighten it up, this will be removed. You don't need a lot of force on this. So just make sure it's all lined up. Perfect. And you don't have to lever, you don't have to stick a crowbar in there, and just generally quite a handy tool. That's quite corroded, isn't it? Look at that. Looks like salt. Now I'm going to remove these main caps, and hopefully no bearings have spun. Now when I turn the crank by hand, there doesn't seem to be any grinding noises. Seems to be pretty normal, but you can never be too careful. So before I go making any further plans, I'm going to just remove these caps, take the crank out, and make sure that the block hasn't been damaged. Now, as you saw when the bearing was spun on the crank, on the conrod rather, as a result the conrod was then basically wrecked in the process. Now we can have bearing failure, and the block would have survived that, but if the bearing has spun, the block will not have survived that. So yeah, let's just whip them off, and hopefully we can reuse the block. Like with the cam caps, these need to be kept in the same order and orientation, and they're actually labelled as well, so there shouldn't be any reason to mess them up. So there's actual ridges on these caps, so you can just have a little bit of leverage and just pop them out. So good news, the block is reusable. I've just given it a quick spray with brake cleaner so we can get an accurate idea of the condition. Every single crank bearing, main bearing then, is in good condition. All of them. Obviously, some of the conrod bearings are showing signs of binding. As you can see there, that's just dirt, but you can see the scratch on there, and obviously this is the one that actually failed, which is absolutely horrendous. So I've removed the crank, and a bit inconclusive. I'm still going with builder error. Now, a couple more things I'd like to talk about. The sort of cleanliness that this engine has been treated to when it was last rebuilt, I don't think it was very high. Here I've just found in the actual crankcase is a bit of oily grass. So this has probably been rebuilt, like I said, in the car, and probably on grass, because there's bits of grass in the engine. This should not be grass in the engine. Another theory I've got is backed up by what I'm seeing here, which we'll talk about in a minute, is this crank pulley has been chipped severely in the past. As you can see, there's chips all around it, which can happen if you try and remove it with a crowbar and not a claw puller, as I showed you earlier in the video. And I think someone's tried basically levering this off in the past. And while that crank pulley has the main job of transferring power to the auxiliary system, such as the alternator and the power steering pump, another name for these is actually a harmonic balancer, and they actually balance out vibrations in the crankshaft. Now, with the massive chips on this, it's actually going to have the opposite effect. It's going to be actually adding a massive amount of vibration to the crankshaft, and this would actually sit this side of the engine for reference. So let's have a look at the condition of the bearings. Here we have signs of metal entering the bearing surface, maybe when the engine was knocking, and some little bits of chip-ins have come through. I don't know, but it's not the worst bearing I've ever seen in this engine. That's quite similar. Got some spots, got some wear. This looks a little worse. This looks much worse. The metal's actually deformed, as you can see here. Where is it? Where am I looking? As you can see here, this is supposed to be a perfectly straight line, and it's actually deformed here and becomes seriously gouged. And also the outer bearing is the same. So the comrod cap on this comrod was on backwards. So the bearing wouldn't have been basically having the correct clearances due to the way they're bored and designed. Also the tab was backwards. So when the tab is on backwards, instead of locking, when it spins, it actually increases the pressure on the crank, basically. So that was one error from the previous builder. Another error, bits of grass. Another error, the bearing wear gets progressively worse the closer we get to this damaged harmonic balancer. So what is my final diagnosis that I'm going to go away with and think about? Well, I'll turn the camera around and I'll let you know. So it's good news. The block and the crank, we can reuse them. The block needs nothing really, and the crank needs to be reground, new bearings, new oil pump. There's a big shopping list, but I'll talk about that in another video, and I'll discuss whether it's going to be more economical to actually rebuild this engine or to just get a second-hand replacement, and discuss the pros and cons of each way of doing it. So I hope you enjoyed this little update, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers guys.